Hello, my name is Harry Kazianis. I'm the managing editor of The National Interest. Today I have a very, very special guest and a very prolific author and one of TNI's most favorite contributors. This is James J. Carafano. James is a vice president at the Heritage Foundation, does a lot of work on many different national security and foreign policy issues, so we're going to pick his brain on a lot of different subjects today. So James, to start out, you had a really big piece on sort of U.S. defense posture in the national interest just in the last couple days. So I wanted to kind of pick your brain and talk sort of broadly about U.S. defense strategy, talking a little bit more about sort of the budget logistics. With all the crises we have now, we have a situation in Ukraine, we have lots of problems with ISIS, we have different situations with China. In terms of dollars and cents, are we spending enough to really secure America's national interests? And where do you see the defense budget going in the next couple of years?
I think it's wrong to start by talking about the bottom line in the budget numbers. Because everybody wants to do that, and then the counter is, well, just be more efficient, whatever. I start with capacity and capability. So the job of the military is to protect America's vital national interests. What levels of capacity and capability do you need to do that? And then, of course, you want to be a good steward of the tax dollars and try to do that as efficiently as possible.
Sure.
So we're heading back towards levels of capacity and capability and budgets that are going to be the same or lower than they were in the 1990s under Bill Clinton, which was the last time we kind of took a big peace dividend. The problem, of course, is we're not at peace. It's not the 1990s. In the 1990s, we didn't have a rising China, we didn't have a rest of Russia, we didn't have a Middle East that was on the verge of collapse. All these areas are critical, vital interests in the United States. Regional wars that really could mushroom into World War III if we weren't careful. So our military is our safety net. It is our insurance policy against poor diplomacy or happenstance kind of spinning out of control. So you have to have the capacity and capability to do that. And I think by any measure, we're lacking that. So the National Defense Panel came out. This was an independent bipartisan commission, Democrats and Republicans. They looked at the problem. They said, look, the defense planning that we've been doing really since 2010 has just been a budget drill. Here's a number, tell me what you can do with this number. It doesn't match the strategic realities that we have. So it's simply got to change. I think 2016 is going to be a critical year. I think Democrats and Republicans want to go into the national election recognizing that the trend line that we're on for defense is unacceptable, that we need to kind of stop the bleeding, that we're in the basement, and we need to talk about rebuilding and revitalizing our military. So what I did in the piece I did for the national interest, I said, okay, if we agree to that, where do we start? And I talked about three things. One is readiness. Every service has a different approach to readiness. The problem with that is they all fight together. It's like having a car that says, yeah, we got a tank full of gas, but no brakes, and the steering wheel doesn't work. So we have to address readiness across the board. I think we have to send a message to the defense industrial base, that we're going to buy stuff at a responsible rate, and we're not going through this, pushing out, pushing off. Stick around for a couple of years and maybe we'll buy something. I mean, look, defense industries, if they're not selling something, they're going to go out of business or they're going to go into a different business. So if we're going to buy stuff, it's more cost effective and efficient to buy at a consistent, even rate. So we ought to do that, especially on the major systems that are really important. And the third thing is, I would start with stopping the cutting on our ground forces. And the reason for that is, one is, it's the quickest way to buy capability back. It takes years to build an aircraft carrier, get a lot of planes, but you can hold on to the ground forces that you have now, which is the most combat ready, well-trained force we've ever had. And you can do something really useful with them. And my argument is, put forces back in Western Europe for two reasons. One is, that sends a strong message to the Russians that we are really serious about our collective security commitments to Western Europe and to NATO. The other thing is, those troops are sitting on top of the Middle East. Not that we want to send troops back into the Middle East or back into Afghanistan, but the fact that they're there, the bad guys are going to be looking over their shoulder, and they're going to be worrying about that. So it would be a ready force in a place to get to many of the challenging areas that we might have to deploy them very quickly. So I think that would be a good thing. I think those are good first steps. You could do that in a good, solid 2016 defense budget. And I think that would be the start out of really 6 years of really shameful defense planning, a huge mismatch between strategic needs and what we've been applying to the force.
No, it seems like the valid point. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little Ebola, unfortunately. Now, you had a recent piece in the National Interest. Dare I say it went viral, but that's basically what it did. let's talk a little bit about the president's strategy, what's really happened since then, because it's been a few weeks since that piece came out. How do you see the president's strategy so far? Has he sort of effectively managed not only the public relations of it, but in terms of just core strategy, trying to get a handle on the problem? Has he been effective, yes or no?
No, and which is stunning 6 years into a presidency to see kind of fumbling the ball on a problem like this. First of all, we ought to acknowledge Ebola is a very deadly and dangerous disease, and we should take it seriously. That said, preventing outbreaks in the United States, which is, I think, job one. Job two is stemming outbreaks in West Africa, helping those countries defeat the disease so it doesn't go global. Those are really the two core tasks. And the president's done, I think, a poor job at managing both of them, and a very poor job of his administrating really communicating risks in a realistic, responsible, credible way to the American people. That's somebody that's been in office for 6 years. This isn't the greatest threat he's faced in 6 years. It's actually compared to dealing with ISIS or even H1N1, which was, I think, a much scarier and potentially greater problem. To fumble the ball like that is really bad. And look what we've gone to. We've gone to, we're managing it out of the White House, which is an incredibly stupid idea. That's how we got Iran-Contra. Look, and the notion that a staffer in the White House like Lisa Monaco is going to manage a national effort to deal with a public health issue here in the United States and a foreign policy crisis overseas, boy, that's about as irresponsible as you can get. So after changing, not because what we're doing wasn't working, but because he was getting criticized for it, and then now we have a czar, which is an equally kind of dumb idea. We have at least three departments that have an enormous amount of responsibility here: Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, and Department of Health and Human Services. And so what you're telling me is there's not a senior official in any of those three departments that is competent to coordinate with the other two to get things done, that you have to appoint a political hack that doesn't really have any street cred at all in dealing with public health issues to put in charge. So we go from a really dumb idea on how to manage this to another really dumb idea on how to manage this on a president that's been in office for 6 years. Boy, I think that just takes your breath away.
For sure. So moving a little bit now towards the Middle East, in terms of the situation with Iran right now, we have some negotiations going on, and there's a lot of talk there could be a deal, there may not be a deal. Where do you see this ending up? Do you think a deal is possible? And the broad parameters that are out there, do you think that is in the America's interest to get a deal on Iran's nuclear program?
So there are two questions going into absolutely opposite directions. Yeah. Can we do a deal? Absolutely. We can get a deal tomorrow if we give Iran exactly what it wants. Right? Can we get a deal that actually serves U.S. interests? And I think the honest answer is no, because there is no deal that I can conceive of that they could put on the table that the Iranians would sign where the countries of concern would be confident that Iran would not retain the capacity in the future to have a breakout nuclear capability. And that's the real concern. So what's the value of a deal that isn't going to reassure Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the United States and Great Britain and other countries that might be in the range of Iranian missiles? What value does that get you? None. And what are they going to do for you? So the phrase the Iranians are going to help us fight ISIS because they're enemies. Well, dude, we know they're enemies, right? The Iranians have been funding Hezbollah to try to kill ISIS. They've been funding Assad to try to kill ISIS. If the Iranians could help you with ISIS, they'd have done that already. So they're not going to do anything for you that they're not doing now. All they're going to do for you is they're going to pump a lot more money into the Shia militias, which are going to destabilize the country. You're basically buying off the Iranians to make more trouble for you. I mean, I think there are two great threats in the Middle East. I think an ISIS state in Iraq is simply intolerable and a great danger to our interests. And I think the other is an Iranian foreign policy, which is always dangerous in meddling and destabilizing. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy is your enemy. So Iran was really on the ropes. I mean, look, because they had a foreign policy which they were using surrogates to do all kinds of evil all throughout the region. But think about it. They're propping up Hamas. They're propping up Hezbollah. They're propping up Assad. They're propping up the Shia militia with an economy that was running on fumes. And what do? We walk in and we give them sanctions relief. Now, what are they using that for? To better the life of the people of Iran? No. to pay off the cronies in the government, and to fund other people to do things against our interests. It's kind of nuts. So I think we would be much better off with a very vigorous, strong sanctions regime. That's the most useful thing in the short term that would help limit Iranian power and limit the Iranian threat, really, to destabilizing the Middle East.
Okay. Well, now you mentioned ISIS, so I think that's probably the next relevant place to go. When we think of ISIS, there's been a lot of talk and debate even on the National Interest website about if an American residual force had been left in place. People talk 5,000, 10,000 troops. Would that been enough to contain ISIS, stop them? How do you see it?
Yeah, so I am in the camp that says there are no do-overs in history. That we could argue this forever,
sure,
and it doesn't really matter because we are where we are. Having said that, and we could debate the wisdom of taking the troops out. What we can't debate is that the president didn't try.
Mm-hmm.
We know that for a fact. He did not try. He didn't really care. He didn't want the troops to stay. He didn't want a status of forces agreement. He wanted to leave, and that's. I mean, they can deny that all day long, but that's the truth. So here's where I think we could have gone a different direction. When Syria imploded, my number one recommendation was put American troops back in Iraq. Because if we had done that, and I think the Iraqis would have let us do that, that would have prevented ISIS from spilling over into Iraq, which is really the real strategic threat. An ISIS state is intolerable to America for two reasons. One is it's going to create a larger sectarian conflict. That could potentially lead to a regional civil war. That might not stop with a regional civil war. And the other is a terrorist-sponsored state in Iraq would be much greater threat than Afghanistan on September 10th, 2001. That is a transnational terrorist threat that I think that's intolerable. So we have every reason not to find the ISIS having a geographical state in Iraq acceptable to us, and I think we should do everything possible to help push them out. I think that ought to be priority one for foreign policy.
Okay. So my final question, to go on a totally different subject. You've done a lot of work on cyber warfare. So thinking broadly, how do you see sort of U.S. strategic capabilities in terms of cyber? There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of speculation, but there doesn't seem to be a consensus of sort of what we're doing. And in terms of our defensive capabilities, a lot of talk about China, different countries breaking into not only U.S. government computers, but a lot of defense contractors, possibly getting blueprints of very advanced U.S. defense capabilities. So how do you see where U.S. cyber capabilities are now, and where do you think they're going in the future?
Well, cyber is an environment to live in, not a problem to solve. And I think often the mistake that we make in cybersecurity is people think that write a law, pass a policy, buy a firewall, and we're done here. The reality is it's a competitive environment that's never going to cease being competitive. So in a sense, there is no answer. It's like saying, I don't like weather. You're not going to solve weather. Learn how to survive in changing weather all the time and adapt to it. That's what we need to do. So step number one is don't put the government in charge. One of the things that we do at Heritage is we track major breaches of cybersecurity in federal systems. So if you actually look at the federal government's record on cybersecurity, it's actually worse than the private sector. So this notion that somehow we're going to put government in charge of this and let government set the standards, that's an incredibly wacky idea. It's actually going to make us much more vulnerable. So a law which essentially gives the government kind of say on how we defend our private sector systems isn't probably the smartest thing. It's also a bad idea in a sense to put the UN or somebody else in charge. There's this idea in the UN called digital blue helmets. So it's the idea we'll have UN peacekeepers in cyberspace like we do in physical space. Well, I don't know how much you know about blue helmets, but they don't actually do a very good job of keeping the peace. This notion of somehow turning the cyber world over to the UN, boy, that is not going to work at all. So cyber treaties, global norms, those aren't really going to work. It really is about, it's going to be a roller coaster. There's going to be private sector efforts, there's going to be public sector efforts. I think the best thing is that when we share situational awareness, we understand what the threats are. There's not a simple answer here, other than this is as much a part of governance as any task. So I would like to see the federal government start by being kind of a better steward of their own federal systems, I actually think the private sector is going to be better at this, because what we're seeing is there's a lot of costs to getting it wrong, and big companies are paying a big price for screwing up, and they're learning that, and they're actually becoming much better defenders of their system. My guess is what we will see is the private sector will kind of lead the way, and government will be adapting best practices from the private sector. But the Chinese are not going to stop, and the Russians aren't going to stop. So get used to it. But the number one hacker continues to be us, right? We hack ourselves more than still more than anybody else. But China and Russia are huge cyber threats. Absolutely.
Fair enough. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. My name is Harry Kazianis, and again, I've been speaking with James J. Carafano of the Heritage Foundation.